In the year 1926, on an August morning, a group of folklorists arrived on the west coast of Ireland at an abandoned village on the shores of Loch Mask, where children had been disappearing for 3 years in a row. They carried notebooks with oiled covers and photographic plates in wooden boxes, but found tracks by the water, too long for a human, too regular for an animal, and bones, gnawed and bleached, scattered along the shore like offerings. What rose from those depths on August nights left only scratches on the rotten planks of the pier, 4 bodies in the cold water, and knowledge that no folklore archive could contain. So, before we continue, please make sure you're subscribed and let us know where you're watching from. Thank you. I was 24 years old when Dr. Margaret Campbell invited me to join a British Folklore Society expedition to investigate disappearances in County Mayo. The morning of our departure from Dublin was heavy with dampness that clung to our faces and settled on our clothes in fine droplets. Fog hung low over the cobbled streets, and the sun broke through it as pale as if shining through oiled cloth. The temperature was moderate for August, but the humidity made the air sticky and unpleasant on the skin. By noon, when we reached the west coast, the wind from the Atlantic had dispersed the fog, but brought with it a cold that made us shiver even in our wool coats. Our equipment took up 2 carts, a Thornton Pickard camera with a tripod and a box of glass plates, notebooks with oiled covers, ordnance survey maps in metal tubes, compasses, 2 kerosene lamps, a canvas awning for temporary shelter, hemp ropes, a supply of candles in tin boxes, and the personal belongings of each member of the expedition. We took provisions for 2 weeks: rye crackers in linen bags, salted meat in wooden barrels, dried peas, hard cheese wrapped in waxed paper, tea in tin cans, and several bottles of whiskey to warm us up on cold evenings. Dr. Margaret Campbell led our group, a woman in her 40s with gray streaks in her dark hair, who always carried a leather bag with notebooks and pencils sharpened to a fine point. Patrick O'Malley, our guide, was a fisherman from Loch Mask, a broad-shouldered man of 52 with hands scarred from fishing lines and nets, who smoked a pipe even in the rain, shielding it with his palm. James Holloway served as the expedition's photographer, a thin man with nervous fingers who constantly checked his plates and wiped his lenses with a soft cloth. Eleanor Grayson, an illustrator, carried a folding easel on her back and charcoal pencils in a leather case on her belt. Bridget Mulligan translated from Irish, a young woman of 28 with a notebook in which she wrote down local expressions and phrases in neat handwriting. Seamus O'Connor was the youngest among us, the 16-year-old son of a village blacksmith, hired to carry equipment, with broad shoulders and curious eyes that were constantly moving, studying everything around him. We left Dublin at first light on August 7th, heading west on a road that led through marshes and low hills. By evening, we reached the village of Ballintuber, where we spent the night in a hotel, and the next morning we continued on to Loch Mask. The road narrowed, winding between stone fences and fields where sheep grazed on sparse grass. The lake suddenly opened up around a bend, a dark mirror of water stretching for several miles, surrounded by low hills covered with heather and sparse willows. The shores were rocky, with strips of gray sand and silt exposed at low tide. The water had a strange greenish tint even under the clear sky, as if colored by something deeper than simple mud. An abandoned village stood on the north shore. A dozen stone houses with collapsed roofs, their walls covered with moss and ivy. The windows gaped like empty eye sockets, the doors torn from their hinges or thrown wide open. The only intact building was the priest's house, where the slate roof still held and the shutters remained on the windows. Patrick said that Father Colum Fitzpatrick sometimes came here for services, even though there were almost no parishioners left. We set up camp in the priest's house on August 8th around noon. Inside, it smelled damp and moldy, but the floor was dry and the hearth was working. James set up his camera by the window. Eleanor laid out her supplies on the table, and Dr. Campbell hung his maps on the wall. Patrick lit a fire with dry peat he had brought with him in canvas bags. In the evening, we were visited by old Nora O'Shea, a stooped woman of 78 in a black dress and shawl leaning on an ash stick. Bridget translated her words as the old woman spoke quickly and quietly, clutching Dr. Campbell's hands with her trembling fingers. She said it was unsafe by the lake after dark, that the snatchers were waiting in the water, and now they didn't just take children. They took anyone who went too far. She said we would see green eyes glowing under the water, and then there would be no escape. The old woman took a wooden amulet out of her pocket, a rough carving of a hand with broken fingers, and placed it on the table between us. Tears ran down her wrinkled cheeks as she spoke of her grandson, who had disappeared 3 years ago at the old pier. Patrick walked her to the door, and we watched her hobble away into the gathering twilight, bent under the weight of her memories. Dr. Campbell wrote everything down in her notebook in neat handwriting. She said that local superstitions often contain a grain of truth, distorted by time and fear, and that our job is to separate fact from fantasy. We dined on salted meat and biscuits dipped in hot tea while the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. We spent the first night peacefully, although the wind howled in the chimney and somewhere far away on the lake the water splashed. On the third day of our stay, Patrick noticed that the ducks had disappeared. Usually the lake was teeming with waterfowl, mallards, teals, coots, but now the surface of the water remained empty and motionless. He said that in 50 years on this lake, he had never seen anything like it, and fishermen from neighboring villages refused to go out on the water even for money. Their boats lay overturned on the shore, chains threaded through the oarlocks and locked with heavy padlocks. We spent the day surveying the shore and gathering evidence from local residents through Bridget. The old people talked about the disappearances that began 5 years ago. At first, rarely, then more often. Children disappeared by the water at dawn or dusk. Their bodies were not always found, and when they were, they had strange injuries, multiple broken limbs, and marks on their throats and shoulders that looked like they had been made by long, thin fingers. During the day, the lake seemed harmless, just a wide expanse of dark water under a gray sky. But when the sun began to set and fog rose from the surface like a white veil, everything changed. The air became denser, sounds were muffled, and the lake seemed to close itself off from the world, turning into something separate and alien. At night, lying on the floor of the priest's house in my sleeping bag, I heard strange sounds coming from the lake. Regular circular splashes, as if something large was moving in a spiral beneath the surface, creating waves that rolled to the shore with a steady, almost rhythmic noise. I got up and went to the window. The moon shone through the clouds, reflecting in the water as pale spots. In the center of the lake, circles spread out, one after another, evenly, methodically. I watched until they stopped as suddenly as they had begun. On the fourth morning, Seamus ran to the priest's house, pale-faced and breathless. He said he had heard a child crying from the middle of the lake before dawn when he went out to relieve himself. The voice was calling for help in Irish, thin and desperate, but when the young man approached the water, the sound stopped. He stood on the shore for several minutes, listening to the silence, but the crying did not resume. Patrick turned pale when he heard this and said that grindhounds hunt in this way. They imitate children's voices to lure them to the water. Dr. Campbell insisted on a scientific approach. She said that the acoustics of the lake could create strange effects, reflecting sounds from distant shores, and that we should not give in to mass hysteria. But I saw her hand tremble as she recorded Seamus's testimony. That same day, Patrick checked his fishing nets, which had been left overnight on the shore 20 paces from the priest's house. The nets had been pulled ashore and lay on the rocks, methodically torn apart, each mesh torn separately, as if by long, thin fingers that had slipped through the loops and torn thread by thread. The work would have taken a person several hours, but there were no footprints in the sand, only wet spots that dried quickly in the morning sun. Patrick gathered the remains of the nets silently. His jaw clenched and did not set them again. By noon, a faint smell had spread along the shore where we were working. It was sharp and old, like stagnant lake water mixed with rotting algae, but underneath it was a sweetish note of decay and a metallic taste that settled on the tongue. The smell grew stronger near the water and faded with distance, as if it were coming from the lake itself. Eleanor grimaced and backed away from the shore, pressing a handkerchief to her nose. James said it was just slime and dead fish, but I noticed he was breathing shallowly and rapidly. On the afternoon of August 5th, we explored the old boat dock, an abandoned wooden structure that extended 20 meters into the lake. The boards were rotten and had collapsed in several places, creating dangerous gaps over the dark water. Under the docks, the depth reached 4 to 5 meters, and the water there was particularly dark and still, shaded by overhanging willows. The locals completely avoided this place, but Dr. Campbell insisted on examining it, since this was where old Nora's grandson had disappeared. James set up his camera on the shore, preparing to photograph the pier. Eleanor sketched the structure in charcoal on thick paper. Patrick walked across the boards first, testing the strength of each step with a long pole. During the night, something struck the wall of the priest's house twice. A soft knock, followed by a longer scrape that moved from the corner to the window with a slow pressure. I woke up to the sound and lay motionless in the dark, listening. The blows repeated, 2 short ones, then a long scratch on the stone. Patrick got up and took the gaff. We stood in the dark, listening, but the sound stopped. In the morning, we found deep grooves on the stone wall, as if made by claws or bone growths, running at chest height from the corner of the house to the window. On August 6th, while exploring the shore south of the village, we found tracks in a strip of wet silt by the water. The prints were long. I measured them with a boat hook, 35 centimeters from heel to toe. The shape resembled a human foot, but the toes were disproportionately long, up to 15 centimeters each, fanning out widely. Between the toes were clearly imprinted webbing, thick and fleshy. Deep grooves ran along the edges of the footprints, as if from claws or bony growths that dug into the mud with each step. The footprints led from the water to the willow thickets, then back to the lake. Eleanor sketched them with precise proportions, her hand moving quickly and confidently. Dr. Campbell measured the distance between the prints. The stride was almost a meter, too wide for a person of that height. James photographed the footprints, placing a ruler next to them for scale. When he developed the plate that evening in a makeshift darkroom, the image was clear and indisputable. That same day, while searching the shallows near the ruined pier, Seamus found a child's doll 2 meters deep, caught on an underwater root. He pulled it out with a long stick with a hook on the end. The doll was covered in green slime that gave off a pungent smell of mud and decay. Bridget recognized the doll. It belonged to Moira O'Shea, the granddaughter of old Nora, who had disappeared 3 years ago. The slime on the doll glowed with a faint greenish light in the darkness of the priest's house as we examined the find by candlelight. Early in the morning on August 7th, we found bone fragments on the shore 50 paces from the priest's house. Human finger phalanges, gnawed and bleached, scattered along the tide line. Some were old, porous with age, others relatively fresh, with remnants of tissue in the joints. All bore characteristic marks of multiple fractures, as if the fingers had been methodically broken by bending them at unnatural angles. Dr. Campbell gathered them into a canvas bag, her face pale and tense. On the rocks by the water, we found green slime, the same glowing substance that covered the doll. It left trails leading from the lake to the nearest ruined houses in the village, as if something was crawling out of the water and returning. When dry, the slime turned into a gray-green powder with the smell of rotting algae. I collected a sample in a glass jar for Dr. Campbell. While examining the underwater snags at the pier, Patrick found fragments of a child's shirt caught on branches a meter below the surface. The fabric was torn by multiple parallel rips, as if by long, thin claws, running from top to bottom with force. Bridget recognized the fabric pattern. The shirt belonged to a boy who had disappeared last summer. On the evening of August 7th, the smell intensified. The stagnant lake water was now mixed with the metallic taste of old blood and a pungent ammonia smell, similar to reptile urine. The smell hung over the shore like a thick veil, penetrating the priest's house through the cracks in the windows. Eleanor complained of nausea, and Seamus turned pale and went out for some fresh air. Around midnight, we heard a sound coming from the lake. It began as a distant child's cry, thin and plaintive, calling for help in Irish. Bridget translated the words. The child was calling for his mother, saying he was drowning, asking to be saved. The voice was piercing and desperate, so real that Seamus jumped up and ran for the door. Patrick grabbed him by the shoulder and held him back. He said it was a trap, that the Grindylow was imitating a child's voice to lure them to the water. We stood in the darkness of the priest's house, listening. The crying was getting closer, getting louder, and something strange began to emerge. Beneath the child's voice was a gurgling wheeze, as if someone were trying to speak while underwater. The sound transformed, losing its human intonations, turning into a gurgling choke interspersed with the grinding of bone growths against each other and a characteristic clicking, as if long fingers were twitching in the water. James couldn't take it anymore. He said he had to check if it could be a real child, that we had no right to ignore a cry for help. Dr. Campbell ordered him to stay, but he took a kerosene lantern and went out into the night. We followed him, shouting for him to come back. James walked toward the old pier, the lantern swinging in his hand, casting a flickering light on the rotten planks. The crying now came directly from the water beneath the pier, plaintive and insistent. He walked to the edge and raised the lantern above his head, peering into the black surface. A head rose from the water between the pier supports. I saw the top of a skull with two sharp, palm-length bone horns protruding from the forehead. The eyes were large and round, glowing pale green in the darkness, set wide apart on the sides of the head. The irises were phosphorescent, the pupils vertical black slits. The skin was marsh green, smooth and wet, glistening in the light of the lantern. The creature froze for a few seconds, studying James with an unblinking gaze. Then it abruptly thrust one hand out of the water. The arm was disproportionately long, the fingers bony, each about 8 inches long with thick gray webbing between them and black claws at the ends. The fingers grabbed James's ankle with a death grip. He screamed and tried to break free, grabbing the edge of the pier. The boards creaked under his weight. The creature let out a piercing, hissing scream, like the cry of a water bird mixed with a guttural growl, and pulled him down with incredible force. We ran toward the dock, but the boards broke beneath our feet. Patrick held out the boat hook, shouting at James to grab it. James reached out, his fingers inches from the hook, but the creature tugged again and he disappeared beneath the surface. The water churned and foamed. I could see silhouettes beneath the surface. James was struggling, trying to break free, his hands clawing at something slippery and hard. After 40 seconds, the movement stopped. The water calmed. The lantern went out, sinking with him. Deep scratches from James' fingers and broken planks he had tried to grab onto remained on the edge of the pier. We stood in the darkness, listening to the silence of the lake. Then there was a dull thud under the pier, then another. The creature was methodically breaking the supports from below, trying to bring down the structure. We ran to the shore and didn't stop until we reached the priest's house. We bolted the door and pushed a table against the window. Dr. Campbell trembled as she wrote in her notebook in short, broken lines. Eleanor cried quietly in the corner. Seamus sat on the floor, hugging his knees. Patrick loaded an old shotgun with buckshot, his hands shaking. All night long, we heard noises outside. Scratching on the stone walls, gurgling breath under the windows, splashing water at the doorstep. At dawn, the noises stopped. On the morning of August 8th, we found tracks around the priest's house. The same long-fingered, webbed prints leading from the lake to the walls and back. Slime covered the bottom of the door and window frames. Dr. Campbell insisted on continuing the investigation. She said that James's death was a tragedy, but not proof of the supernatural, that the creature could be an unknown species of otter or seal that had adapted to a freshwater environment. Patrick told her she was blind and stubborn, that we should leave this place immediately. They argued until Seamus left the house, saying he was going to the lake to fetch water for washing. We heard his cries a few minutes later. Patrick ran out first and I followed him. Seamus was standing knee-deep in the water 20 paces from the shore. The creature rose up in front of him from the shallows, where the water was only waist-deep. I could see it more clearly now in the daylight. It was about 170 centimeters tall, with a thin body and a disproportionately long torso. Its skin was marsh green with a grayish tint, smooth and wet, covered with transparent slime. Its head was large and elongated, with two bony horns protruding from its forehead. His eyes are huge, round, unblinking, glowing with a pale green light even in daylight. His mouth is a wide slit, full of small, sharp teeth in several rows. Gills opened and closed on his neck, making a gurgling sound. The creature's hands grabbed Seamus by the legs with both palms, long, bony fingers with black claws wrapped around the young man's calves. The membranes between the fingers stretched. It began to pull him into deeper water. Patrick rushed into the lake without taking off his boots. He grabbed Seamus by the arms and pulled him toward him. I jumped in after him and grabbed the young man's shoulders. We pulled in different directions. Patrick and I toward the shore, the creature into the depths. Seamus screamed. The water swirled around us. I could see the creature's face inches from mine. A flat nose with vertical nostrils, a mouth full of backward curving teeth, eyelidless eyes that stared at me with cold curiosity. The smell was unbearable. Rot, blood, ammonia. We held on for several minutes. Our arms ached, our muscles burned. Seamus cried and prayed in Irish. The creature suddenly jerked with redoubled force, and the young man disappeared under the water, breaking free from our grasp. Patrick dived after him. I dived after him. It was dark and cold underwater. I could see silhouettes. Seamus was struggling. Patrick was trying to grab him. The creature was holding the young man with both hands and dragging him into the depths. My lungs began to burn. I surfaced, took a breath, and dove again, but they were already out of sight. We crawled ashore, coughing and gasping for air. Dr. Campbell and Eleanor stood by the water, their faces pale. Bridget prayed aloud, fingering her rosary. Seamus's body surfaced 3 hours later on the opposite shore of the lake. Local fishermen found it and brought it back by boat. His arms and legs were covered in multiple fractures, the bones broken in several places, as if they had been methodically bent and twisted. There were deep indentations on his throat from long fingers, and his skin was torn in several places by black claws. His face was pale and waxy, his eyes open and cloudy. Patrick didn't speak until evening. He sat by the young man's body, covered with a tarpaulin, smoking his pipe in short, sharp puffs. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. He said we had to leave immediately, that the lake had taken enough lives, that he would not let it take any more. Dr. Campbell agreed. We began packing our equipment immediately. The plan was simple. Cross the narrow strait by boat to the road on the opposite side of the lake, where Patrick had left the wagon 3 days earlier. 5 miles by water instead of 20 miles on foot around the shore. We worked quickly, packing only the essentials. Photographic plates, notebooks, samples. We left the rest behind. By the evening of August 10th, everything was ready. Patrick brought an old boat hidden in the willow thickets 100 yards from the village. It was small, barely holding 6 people, but it seemed sturdy. We checked the planks and caulked the cracks with tow we found in the priest's house. The sun was setting, painting the sky a bloody red when we launched the boat. Dr. Campbell sat in the stern, Eleanor and Bridget in the middle. Patrick and I took the oars. Our equipment lay at our feet. We pushed off from the shore at 7:30 in the evening. The water was calm as glass, reflecting the red sky. Fog was beginning to rise from the surface in thin wisps. The oars entered the water almost silently, creating circles on the smooth surface. We had gone 200 meters when the boat jerked. One heavy blow from below made us all grab the sides. The water around us bubbled. Sharp bone horns pierced the bottom of the boat with the crack of breaking wood. Water poured in through 2 fist-sized holes. The boat began to tilt. Eleanor fell into the water first, losing her balance when the boat tilted. She screamed, her skirts wet and pulling her down. The creature surfaced next to her with a fountain of spray. I could see him fully now. He was 5'7" with a stooped figure. His arms were disproportionately long, reaching his knees. His fingers were bony, each 25 centimeters long, with thick webbing and black claws. His torso was thin with protruding ribs. His legs were short, his feet large with long toes. His skin was marsh green, covered with slime, and dark veins showed through the translucent areas. His head was large with bony horns, his eyes huge and glowing, his mouth full of sharp teeth. The gills on his neck pulsed, releasing streams of water. The creature grabbed Eleanor by the shoulders with both hands. Its long fingers wrapped around her, its claws digging into the fabric of her dress and the skin beneath it. It began to pull her down. Eleanor fought back. She remembered the words of old Nora, "Break the fingers, they are fragile." Her hands grabbed one of the creature's left fingers and bent it back with force. There was a crack, and the finger broke at the base, hanging at an unnatural angle. The creature let out a piercing, hissing scream, but its right hand held her in a death grip. Its fingers tightened, digging into her flesh. Eleanor broke another finger, but it didn't help. The creature dragged her underwater methodically and relentlessly. I saw her face below the surface, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. The water around her shoulders turned dark, spreading like a cloud. Then they disappeared into the depths. The boat was sinking. Water filled half of it. We rowed desperately toward the nearest shore. Patrick shouted not to stop, that the creature would return. We reached the shore when the boat was almost completely submerged. We climbed onto the rocks and pulled each other out of the water. Dr. Campbell fell to her knees, vomiting lake water. Bridget cried, repeating prayers. Patrick stood waist-deep in the water, peering into the darkness, holding a gaff at the ready. Eleanor's body did not surface. We ran from the shore without looking back. We ran through the thickets, stumbling over rocks, scratching ourselves on branches. We reached the ruined Catholic chapel on the hill above the lake after 20 minutes of nonstop running. The chapel was made of stone, built in the 14th century, partially collapsed, but with intact walls and part of the roof. It was the only building in the area standing on high ground, far enough away from the water. We barricaded the doorway with stones and logs found inside. We built a fire in the center of the chapel from old church benches. There were 4 of us left: Dr. Margaret Campbell, Patrick O'Malley, Bridget Mulligan, and me, Thomas Whitmore. We didn't sleep the first night in the chapel. We sat around the fire, listening to the sounds outside. We heard scratching on the stone walls, gurgling breath at the base of the hill. The creature couldn't or wouldn't climb so far from the water. At dawn on August 11th, we searched the chapel. On the walls, we found ancient carvings. Water demons with horns and long fingers chasing human figures. Protective symbols carved by medieval monks surrounded every window and doorway. Crosses, intertwined knots, hands with broken fingers. Patrick said the monks knew. They always knew what lived in the lake. We spent 3 days and 2 nights in the chapel. There was no water, no food. We drank rainwater that collected in the hollows of the stone floor. We chewed bark and grass. On the last night, we heard the creature scratching its claws on the walls outside, methodically circling the chapel. The scratching continued for hours, then stopped at dawn. On August 13th, help arrived. The local priest, Father Colum Fitzpatrick, brought a group of men from neighboring villages after we failed to return on time. They found us in the chapel, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. The bodies of James Holloway, Seamus O'Connor, and Eleanor Grayson were never found. The lake held them. We left County Mayo on August 14th. Dr. Campbell wrote a detailed report for the British Folklore Society. The report was rejected with the wording, "psychological trauma causing mass hallucination." The photographic plates James had taken, which we had saved, were declared to be fakes. The samples of slime and bones were deemed insufficient evidence. Dr. Margaret Campbell was dismissed from the University of Edinburgh after continuing to insist on the reality of what had happened. She moved to Wales and worked as a rural teacher under her maiden name. She secretly continued her research into Celtic water mythology, but never published again. In 1952, she gave me a box of notes and sketches of Grindylows made from memory. She died in 1971. The last entry in her diary read, "They are real. They always have been, and they are still there." Patrick O'Malley returned to his village but never went out on the water again. He sold his boat and gear. He became a recluse, rarely leaving his house. He was particularly devastated by the death of Seamus, whom he had been unable to save. In 1934, he was found dead in his bed. On the bedside table lay an open Bible and old Nora O'Shea's amulet with the image of broken fingers. He was buried in a cemetery far from the lake, as he had requested. Bridget Mulligan emigrated to America in 1927. She settled in Boston and changed her name to Betsy Miller. She got married and had 3 children. She never told her family about the events of 1926. She did not allow her children to learn to swim and strictly forbade them from going near lakes. She died in 1989 at the age of 87. On her deathbed, in a delirium, she spoke in Irish about green eyes under the water. As for me, I abandoned my academic career. My report was rejected. I was considered unreliable. I spent the next 30 years collecting evidence about grindhounds and other water creatures throughout the British Isles. I published 3 books, which were ignored by the scientific community, but became cult classics among paranormal researchers. I never married. I died in 1967 in Dublin. In my will, I left all my materials to the National Folklore Archives of Ireland. Until the end of my life, I could not be near open water without having panic attacks. Loch Mask remains. The village is completely abandoned. The old pier has been dismantled. Old Nora O'Shea died, and her amulets were buried with her. In the 1950s, attempts were made to open the lake to tourists, but 3 disappearances of swimmers in 2 years led to the closure of the beaches. Officially, this was due to dangerous underwater currents. The archives of the British Folklore Society contain a sealed file marked the Loch Mask Incident, accessible only with the director's permission. The case remains classified to this day.